contact and soft capture connection and ring retraction. That was at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, so a little less than an hour ago. And we are still on board, as Ronnie, as you mentioned, tracking that welcome remarks and welcoming the crew formally on board the International Space Station around 8:35 a.m. Central Time. So far, everything's still being worked on in terms of those hatch opening procedures as the Dragon spacecraft has connected itself to the Node 2 Zenith port, or the space-facing port of the International Space Station, and we'll bring you back those views as soon as we have them, as we are continuing our coverage all the way up until those welcome remarks and bringing on the Axiom Mission 4 team, the fourth private astronaut mission to the orbiting laboratory. On board the International Space Station as we speak, as you heard those comms checkouts and power and communications checkouts continuing to roll on along. NASA astronauts Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean, who monitored Dragon's progress throughout the morning, from the approach initiation burn all the way through to the contact and capture. They are beginning those hatch opening procedures, and we'll continue to look at the APAS hatch and the pressurized mating adapter. That's the space that separates between the International Space Station and the Harmony module and the Dragon spacecraft itself. And in there, those series of hatches, the APAS hatch is, and the vestibule, of course, is what needs to be pressurized to allow for the APAS hatch on the International Space Station side to be opened and stowed away. And then from that angle, then it'll allow for the Dragon team to open up their side of their hatch. And once the pressure is equal between Dragon, the vestibule, and the International Space Station, that'll allow for the crew to come on board the orbiting laboratory and bring the crew, the Expedition 73 crew, which right now is a crew of 7, and welcome in their guests, Axiom Mission 4, and bring up the total to 11. There you can see on your screen the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft together orbiting over the southeasternmost portion of Australia, and they are in an orbital nighttime period right now, and that'll stretch on for another few more moments, and we hope to have those great views of the space station and the Dragon spacecraft once the sunrise and orbital daytime has returned. And again, tracking an 8:35 a.m. Central Time welcome remark, and shortly before then, you'll see the crew, and we'll have all that coverage and views of the Axiom Mission 4 team making its way into the orbiting laboratory. And again, a great interview there with Michael Lopez Alegria, commander, former NASA astronaut and commander of Axiom 1 and Axiom 3. And the ISS, the International Space Station, ready to welcome in Peggy Whitson, a former NASA astronaut, on her 5th flight, second with Axiom as commander of Axiom 2 and now of Axiom Mission 4, and bringing in pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA, and Tibor Kapu of Hunor, each representing India, Poland, and Hungary respectively. It'll be the first time that those 3 nations have been on board the International Space Station. And that'll bring 14 different private astronaut crew members representing 11 different nations to the orbiting lab, showcasing the strength of private astronaut missions and how it expands access to the International Space Station at low Earth orbit for more nations, people, and opportunities. So we continue to follow along with the hatch opening procedures that Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean of NASA each working diligently through, and we'll continue to provide updates as they arrive. During that interview, we did hear that there was some troubleshooting that they were working on the big loop that has since been resolved. So we should hear communications on that big loop that connects both the Dragon spacecraft, the International Space Station, and the teams on the ground here inside of Mission Control Houston and the International Space Station Flight Control Room at NASA's Johnson Space Center, and well, the teams in Hawthorne, California, and the Mission Control Room at SpaceX. Currently on board the International Space Station. Oh.
Station Houston on the big loop for PMA.
Houston Station, go ahead on the big loop.
Hey, we're about to get you into your next activity, but in the meantime, would you mind setting up a video of the PMA so that we could watch the crew ingress? You can use the Node 2 Camera 1 or Camera 2.
That's going to work.
Thank you.
communications from the ground here in Mission Control Houston up to the International Space Station, that PMA, pressurized mating adapter, and that is where NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers is currently operating in the hatch opening procedures, and they're asking to set up a camera so we can get live views in and witness the Axiom Mission 4 crew as they ingress or enter the International Space Station. So we'll keep an eye out for those views coming from that pressurized mating adapter just inside the Zenith, Node 2 Zenith port of the International Space Station, that space-facing port. Before those communications, I'm going to say aboard the International Space Station as we speak, the 7 members of the Expedition 73 crew, featuring Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers, who are prime characters in today's docking operations, joined by Takuya Onishi of JAXA and Kirill Peskov, alongside NASA astronaut Johnny Kim, Sergei Ryzhikov, and Alexei Zubritsky. You heard during the interview with Michael Lopez Alegria some of those key milestones and celebratory moments that he celebrated in his time as the commander of Axiom at Mission 1 and Axiom Mission 3 earlier, bringing those first-time flyers in Shubhanshu Shukla, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu into microgravity for the very first time. The International Space Station also featuring first-time flyers Nicole Ayers and Kirill Peskov, alongside with Johnny Kim and Alexei Zubritsky. For Ayers and Peskov, they recently just celebrated their 100th day in orbit this past Monday.
You actually have both Node 2 cameras on. You guys are welcome aboard.
Fantastic. Those are great views. Thank you.
And there you see the live view that the team on board the International Space Station has just set up for us to see as we are inside the pressurized mating adapter, looking into what will be the APAS hatch that will eventually be pressurized, and the vestibule pressurized, pardon me, to welcome the Axiom Mission 4 crew aboard once everything is equal in pressure from SpaceX Dragon to the vestibule to the International Space Station, and the hatches on the Dragon and Space Station side are open. Everything will be on schedule to welcome in the 4-member crew. And the, again, welcome remarks tracking for approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time, 9:35 a.m. Eastern. And you heard Michael Lopez Alegria talking about the pinning ceremony that will take place during those welcome remarks. I'm looking forward to seeing those as the team aboard the International Space Station continuing to work through their hatch opening procedures. Since launching from Launch Complex 39A and NASA's Kennedy Space Center yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central, 2:31 a.m. Eastern, the Axiom Mission 4 crew above the newly named Dragon SpaceX Grace spacecraft have tracked down the International Space Station through a stair-stepping procedure of multiple burns that occurred from just moments or a few moments after launch up until the early morning hours today, to allow them to catch up to the orbiting laboratory and set up for the final approach and docking, and that contact with the orbiting laboratory at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. And from that point on, it takes about 2 hours or so to allow for the hatch opening and hard mating procedures to be complete, umbilicals to be run, power and communications to be connected. And once everything is set, that's where you'll begin to see the hatch opening procedures and lead up to those welcoming remarks. And as you're following along with us, as we continue to wait for views of the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft as they are in an orbital nighttime period making their way across the Pacific Ocean and approaching the equator, almost right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We'll get those views back from the exterior cameras. And the astronauts on board the International Space Station continuing to configure the cameras for views inside the orbiting lab. If you are just joining us, you are watching live coverage of the docking of Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station, the fourth private astronaut mission to the orbiting lab and the first since January of 2024. Docking has occurred, and that was exactly an hour ago, 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern. And now with Axiom Mission 4 attached to the International Space Station, docking and leak checks and hatch procedures and opening procedures continuing to move along. The crew aboard the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft going through their procedures, as well as the 7 members of the Expedition 73 crew who are in the middle of their workday, and namely NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean, who oversaw today's approach monitoring from the cupola of the International Space Station, that window to the world that you see so many wonderful views from. And Nicole Ayers currently working in the space-facing hatch of the Harmony module, where on the other side of the APAS hatch and vestibule is the Dragon SpaceX spacecraft. Ayers will use a small valve on that station's hatch to slowly introduce air into the vestibule. That's the space between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. That area has been exposed to vacuum of space, so that needs to be brought up to 1 atmosphere, or about 14 psi, what we know here on Earth as the pressure at sea level. And the flight controllers here in Houston will continue to monitor that pressure and temperature readings inside and verify that everything is leak-free before we go ahead and open up the hatches. Just received communications from the team here inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room that the vestibule leak check has been successful, and it is good. So they will continue to move forward with the hatch opening procedures. And again, you heard in the interview with Michael Lopez Alegria, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, as these teams making sure everything is sealed up and safe as they continue through hatch opening procedures.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. We are doing some more troubleshooting for the C2V2 audio issue, so Big Loop is going to be down for another 5 minutes. In the meantime, you are go to pick up in step 3.1 of 2.102, and NASA TV should be available on VME TV now.
There you heard communications radioed up to the crew aboard the International Space Station on the big loop that they are continuing with troubleshooting of that communications as we are looking live up towards that node to zenith hatch in the Harmony module, and you see several members of the Expedition 73 crew in and out of the field of view. That is Nicole Ayers going into the pressurized mating adapter and continuing hatch opening procedures, and she is wearing the long-sleeved navy polo. And the red polo that just flew by, that is Expedition 73 Commander Takuya Onishi. We've also seen glimpses of Anne McLean in the field of view, as well as certainly everybody aboard the International Space Station anxious and excited to welcome Axiom Mission 4 with Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubhanshu Shukla, mission specialist Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski, and the mission specialist Tibor Kapu aboard the orbiting laboratory. This is Mission Control Houston. If you are just joining us, you are following along with live coverage of the docking and soon-to-be hatch opening and welcome remarks of Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station. The mission began with the launch off of Launch Complex 39A and NASA's Kennedy Space Center yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central, 2:31 a.m. Eastern. That took them on a journey that was a little more than a day to get them to the orbiting lab. They have since docked, and contact was at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. And after the connections made, the hooks driving to form the hard mate, umbilicals with power and communications connections all run. Now it is those hatch opening procedures and leak checks that the crew is currently working through aboard the International Space Station, while the crew aboard the
on 2 for step 3.2, seeing about 0 for the DBTT, looking for your go to continue.
We see the same. You're good to proceed.
And continued communications as Nicole Ayers once again floating into that pressurized mating adapter and continuing those hatch opening procedures to welcome Axiom Mission 4. The target welcoming remark ceremony time, 8:35 a.m. Central. So a little more than 2 hours from now as leak checks and pressurization checks continue on before the APAS hatch and the vestibule and all procedures can be completed. And a great view of some of those procedures as Nicole Ayers, again, you can see her with that right hand turning the crank and working on that hatch to continue those procedures.
Dragon, station. This is Houston on the big loop for comm checks.
Dragon has you loud and clear. Dragon on the big loop. We have you loud and clear.
And Dragon, we read you the same.
Great communications checks there as the teams on the ground continuing to work on those communications between the International Space Station and the ground, as well as the teams here in Mission Control Houston and Dragon, as we are watching live inside of the International Space Station up into the Node 2 Zenith hatchway, as NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers continuing with her hatch opening procedures. Docking of Axiom Mission 4 to the orbiting laboratory occurred about an hour and 10 minutes ago at 5:31 a.m. Central, and since then the crews for both station and inside Dragon have been going through those procedures and making sure everything is as it needs to be, including the proper leak checks and stowage from both perspectives, before continuing on with hatch opening procedures and welcoming remarks. We'll continue to provide updates, and you'll hear calls on the big loop of all four parties: NASA's Mission Control and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, SpaceX in Hawthorne, California, and the teams and the Expedition 73 crew aboard the International Space Station and Axiom Mission 4 aboard the Dragon and Grace
Dragon Houston
spacecraft.
On the big loop. Stand by for hardline audio config.
Dragon copies.
Also a part of these procedures, and once hatch opening continues to move along, the crews will install IMV ducting to help mix the air of the space station environment with the air inside of Dragon and seal up some of those lithium hydroxide cartridges that scrub the carbon dioxide inside of the Dragon spacecraft. And that was on their ride to the International Space Station. They'll also check some vent valves as we go, and maybe need a little bit more time on board, but these last final checks are crucial to make sure everything is good to go, since it will remain docked to the International Space Station for nearly 2 weeks. With the arrival of Axiom Mission 4 and the Dragon Grace spacecraft, newly named and given by Peggy Whitson, commander of Axiom Mission 4, shortly after launch yesterday morning, that now brings 5 spacecraft to the International Space Station: 2 Dragon spacecraft, a Soyuz MS-27 spacecraft, and 2 Progress vehicles, cargo vehicles, attached to the orbiting outpost. For Dragon, it is Endurance and Grace, connected to the forward and now Zenith ports of the Harmony module, with 2 Progress vehicles and that Soyuz MS-27 also connected. And once the Axiom Mission 4 crew makes its way aboard station, that'll bring, since 1998, 288 visitors to the orbital outpost. Nicole Ayers, NASA astronaut, has returned to inside the pressurized mating adapter and working on the APAS hatch and hatch opening procedures as we continue to get great views from inside the International Space Station.
Check. Hardline audio configuration complete, and we have resolved the audio issues on C2V2.
That sounds great, because we have you loud and clear.
We read you the same.
And that was a good communications checkout from the teams on the ground up to Dragon Grace on the C2V2 line, common communications for visiting vehicles, and that communications line connecting all parties. As we continue to work through hatch opening procedures, and again targeting approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time for welcoming remarks as the International Space Station and Expedition 73 crew bring in and welcome aboard Axiom Mission 4. Both the orbiting laboratory and the newly docked SpaceX Dragon spacecraft over the northern Pacific Ocean, about to cross into the west coast of North America, right along the U.S.-Canadian border. And also around that time, we will start seeing an orbital daytime period as Dragon and the International Space Station have been orbiting in a nighttime phasing. Currently experiencing a satellite handover period, and we'll continue to bring you the live views from the International Space Station, both inside or exterior. Once communications is established, which should be here in the next few moments. Until then, you can see on this map where exactly we're talking about, where the station and Dragon orbiting over the Pacific Ocean and about to cross over North America and over the northernmost territories of Canada. As we wait for those communications to return, to recap, Axiom Mission 4 has connected with the International Space Station after launching from NASA's Kennedy Space Center yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central Time to connect with the space station at 5:31 a.m. Central this morning. So a little more than a day's transit, and where it would execute a sequence of burns to raise its altitude and close the distance between Dragon spacecraft, Dragon Grace, and the International Space Station through a phase burn, boost burn, close burn, transfer burn, and then eventually the co-elliptic burn to make sure that the spacecraft is on the same pathway as the International Space Station and able to make its way up and over top of it to connect to the space-facing port of the Harmony module, the Node 2 Zenith port, as we now get views back inside of the International Space Station. That is the view from the other side. We mentioned the space-facing port. That is looking up into where the hatchways will be to allow for the Axiom mission 4 crew to pass through and be brought aboard the International Space Station for Peggy Whitson, commander of Axiom Mission 4, her second flight as an Axiom commander after previously serving as commander of Axiom Mission 2. This is her 5th flight and return to the International Space Station, where she continues to build on an impressive career, the most experienced United States astronaut. Entered the mission with 675 days to her credit, and will certainly add to that record-setting total in her time aboard the orbiting laboratory and bringing up pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski of Polsa, and Tibor Kapu of Hunor. And for Shukla, Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Kapu representing India, Poland, and Hungary respectively, for those nations, it'll be their first time coming to the International Space Station. Nicole Ayers. And the last one into the hatch, I believe that was Anne McLean making her way in as they continue to work through hatch opening procedures. In the middle there, that is Expedition 73 Commander Takuya Onishi of JAXA. And then you just momentarily saw NASA astronaut Johnny Kim float in and out of view as the crew working together to continue these procedures, moving around some equipment, and to allow for the access to the A-Pass hatch. After successful vestibule pressurization and checks. And that's the operations that Nicole Ayers is working on right now with Takuya Onishi. And Johnny Kim with camera in hand to document these procedures. And again, just on the other side of this hatchway is where the Axiom Mission 4 crew going through procedures of their own, inventory and doffing their suits that they wore on the uphill ride to their initial orbit. And after an off-duty period would put back on for those dynamic phases of flight, starting with the approach initiation burn that occurred earlier this morning. If you are just joining us, good morning from Mission Control in Houston in the International Space Station Flight Control Room as we are looking live inside of the International Space Station as NASA astronauts Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean alongside with Commander of Expedition 73 and JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi going through a hatch opening procedures. And there you can see as the team has worked together to open up that A-Pass hatch. and continue on with those procedures to welcome aboard eventually the Axiom Mission 4 crew with the welcome remarks. Currently still targeting.
The big loop, the APAS hatch is open and no condensation observed on the field.
Houston copies. Looks great. Thank you.
And a perfect call down right there, as that is the APAS hatch that we were just mentioning that Nicole Ayers and team have opened up and radioing down the status and condition of that hatch with no condensation reported. And as Nicole Ayers continues to work on that hatch, you'll also see that hatch be covered up to give an extra level of safety to allow for the Axiom Mission 4 team to pass smoothly without having to worry about any additional hazards as they pass through the vestibule and pressurized mating adapter and eventually into the Harmony module of the International Space Station. Another step in this hatch opening procedure is the removal of the docking cross, which it looks like that is what Nicole Ayers is working on as we speak. And you sometimes catch glimpses of it on the docking procedures that was exposed to the vacuum of space to help provide targeting for visiting vehicles. But that'll be another step in this hatch opening process, again, to help clear the way for that pass-through between the Dragon SpaceX Grace spacecraft and the International Space Station. Hatch opening procedures continuing to move along for the teams aboard the International Space Station and Axiom Mission 4 as we draw closer and closer to the anticipated hatch opening and eventual welcome remarks. And we thank you for tuning in and joining us this morning as we are live from the International Space Station Flight Control Room in Houston, Texas, monitoring Nicole Ayers as she continues to work through those step-by-step procedures. As the hatchway, there you see the large square structure just off to the right-hand side of our field of view with that window in the middle was
Station
opened up.
Houston on the big loop. Just want to clarify, we want the standoff cross stowed in the standoff cross cover bag.
Station copies.
And that's the teams here on the ground assisting the astronauts on board the station with those hatch opening procedures. As again, that zenith hatchway we were just mentioning before the comms open to the right that allowed Nicole Ayers and team to pass through. And that docking cross that was just removed will be inserted into its own bag. And there is NASA astronaut Ann McLean to join Ayers in the hatchway and continue on with those procedures as they now look to cover up the APAS hatch, which was just opened a few moments ago, to provide an extra layer of safety and protection for astronauts passing through.
Dragon. Suit drying is complete.
And Dragon, we copy on the big loop, suit drying complete.
Good insight there from the Axiom Mission 4 perspective of their procedures that they are currently going through in anticipation of hatch opening, and welcome remarks as they make their way into the International Space Station after connecting and docking to the International Space Station about an hour and a half ago. 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern. They went through their procedures, inventory, and stowage, and doffing of their suits that they wore from launch yesterday morning from Cape Canaveral, Florida, and NASA's Kennedy Space Center, and then during the dynamic portions of operations, and are now settling into their flight suits that they will bring in and wear as they cruise into the International Space Station. And that's the view we see from the orbiting laboratory is NASA astronaut Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers working through their procedures for hatch opening. The APAS hatch is open after successful vestibule pressurization and checks. They are now covering up that APAS hatch.
SpaceX Dragon in step 5 of 2.102. We're waiting your go for hatch open.
Dragon, SpaceX copies on the big loop. You are standing by for hatch opening. We are waiting for hardline connections to be complete. I'll call back with a go.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to rush you.
And there you heard Axiom Mission 4 Commander Peggy Whitson radioing down to the team at SpaceX. They are awaiting the go for hatch opening. I'd imagine the crew aboard the Dragon Gray spacecraft anxious and excited to float into the International Space Station for the very first time. And you just saw that orange ductwork or hose-like piece of equipment that Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers were just operating with. That's a part of helping mix the air between the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft. They'll continue to check some vent valves as well, so it just might be a little bit more time before we welcome the crew on board. But these final checks, again, critical to making sure that everything is good and sealed tight with no leaks and no issues, as Dragon Grace will be docked to the International Space Station for approximately the next 2 weeks.
Houston, SpaceX station is ready for Dragon hatch equalization.
Houston, copy. Stand by.
Another step in those hatch opening procedures is Nicole Ayers just radioed down for the SpaceX Dragon hatch pressurization and equalization. As you see the pop of flash bulbs aboard the International Space Station being documented, and plenty of smiles from the Expedition 73 crew as we draw closer and closer to hatch opening and welcoming Axiom Mission 4 aboard the orbital outpost. Meanwhile, here on the ground inside NASA's Mission Control, the International Space Station Flight Control Room, anticipation also building up as the room starting to fill with NASA leadership, as well as the Athena flight team continuing to work through the hatch opening procedures. Flight Director Allison Bollinger closely monitoring every step of the way as Nicole Ayers is continuing to work through each checkpoint on her list. That's what you saw on the little tablet that she was referring to, making sure every step is covered as she has now floated back into the pressurized mating adapter across the APAS hatch.
Station Houston on the big loop. We're still working some ground config actions before we're ready for equalization. In the meantime, can we get confirmation that the standoff cross went into the standoff cross bag? We were unable to tell from the video.
It was in there when you guys called. Thanks.
Copy, thanks.
Hearing communications from teams on the ground as they continue to work through hatch opening procedures and making sure all pressurization and leak checks are good and everything equal between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station before the hatches can be formally opened on both sides. You can see into this hatchway, the space-facing port, or into the space-facing side of the Harmony module aboard the International Space Station and the International Docking Adapter that welcomed the connection of Axiom Mission 4 at 5:31 a.m. Central Time earlier this morning. And since then, the crews aboard both the Dragon Gray spacecraft and International Space Station have been diligently working and continue to monitor the progress of that hatch opening with teams on the ground also following suit.
Station Dragon Houston on the big loop. Stand by for equalization. Expected to take 1 minute.
Station copies 1 minute. Dragon copies 1 minute.
Great communications there from all teams here at NASA's Johnson Space Center and International Space Station Mission Control Room, teams in the SpaceX in Hawthorne, California, and everyone aboard the Dragon SpaceX Grace in Axiom Mission 4 and the International Space Station as we continue to march towards the hatch opening to welcome Axiom Mission 4 aboard the orbiting laboratory.
Dragon SpaceX, on the big loop, you are go for hatch opening per the decal, followed by the remaining actions in procedure 4.400, section 6.
Dragon copies, go for hatch open and remainder of steps in 4.400.
We are go for hatch opening is what you have just heard. And if you are just now joining us, you are tuned into live coverage of the arrival of Axiom Mission 4, the International Space Station.
And SpaceX Dragon, hatch is coming open.
SpaceX copies.
Expedition 73 crew anxiously awaiting as we just received the go for hatch opening to welcome Axiom Mission 4 into the International Space Station. There you see Ann McLean in the foreground working on the tablet, alongside with Johnny Kim on the far right-hand side, NASA astronaut, and then Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov next to him, with Alexei Zubritsky and Sergei Ryzhikov, also of Roscosmos, in that mix. And right there in the middle, almost standing, if you will, from our perspective, is Expedition 73 Commander and JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi. From this view, they are looking up.
SpaceX Dragon, hatch is open at 12:14, and we're requesting the go for the LIO change.
Copy 1214 Zulu hatch opening time, and you are go for LIO swap.
And there you heard that the hatch is open and confirmed at 7:14 a.m. Central Time, as the hatches are open between SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft and the International Space Station. Again, 7:14 a.m. Central, 8:14 a.m. Eastern. And you heard also the swaps of the LIO canisters. That's the lithium hydroxide cartridges that scrub the carbon dioxide inside of the Dragon spacecraft on the ride to the International Space Station. Also, Nicole Ayers out of view, but if from this perspective, looking up, she is operating with the Axiom Mission 4 team to help refresh the air and cycle air between the two craft as they continue a few more procedures before floating across and into the orbiting laboratory for the first time.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop for LIO cartridge.
Go ahead for LIO cartridge.
Just looking for clarification on your next action there. We're tracking LIO cartridge sealing per 2.102 step 6.5.
Oh, okay. And in my procedure, I had put instructions on the decal for section. For section 4 of the instructions on the decal.
And copy that, Peggy. We'll defer to the instructions in 2.102.
Okay, that's where we are.
You just heard communications between Axiom Mission 4 Commander Peggy Whitson and the teams on the ground as they were talking about the swapping of the lithium hydroxide cartridges as the hatch has been opened between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station just a few moments ago at 7:14 a.m. Central Time. And this is a view inside the International Space Station, looking forward, if you will, as the astronauts and cosmonauts aboard are looking up. That is towards the space-facing port of the Harmony module. That's where they are in now. If you were to keep going forward, if you will, that is the forward port, which currently is occupied by Dragon Endurance from Crew 10. And a great microgravity demonstration of the camera that Alexei Zubritsky is using to help document and be a part of the welcoming committee for Axiom Mission 4 here in the next few moments.
Dragon Houston on the big loop. Just to confirm, we want to make sure IMV duct installation is complete before we do LIO cartridge sealing.
Yes, the IMV duct installation is complete. My bad, I didn't get it reported.
Houston copies.
Now we switch views from pretty much the point of view of what the astronauts have been looking at. From what we have seen, they were looking up, and this is the shot up into that node to zenith hatchway of the Harmony module. That is Nicole Ayers, NASA astronaut, just on the other side of that APAS hatchway, working with the Axiom Mission 4 crew. You heard them talking about IMV ducting and LIO cartridges. That IMV ducting helps mix the air of the International Space Station environment with the air inside of Dragon. And then also looking to seal up some of those lithium hydroxide cartridges that are used to scrub carbon dioxide from the air in the spacecraft on their journey to the International Space Station. And that journey started yesterday morning, 1:31 a.m. Central Time, 2:31 a.m. Eastern, as they would launch on the SpaceX Dragon, newly named Grace spacecraft, on a Falcon 9 rocket from Launch Pad 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, and would chase down the International Space Station earlier this morning at 5:31, nearly 2 hours ago, 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern, a little bit more of a day's transit.
Houston and SpaceX Dragon arrival configuration is complete.
Houston copies.
SpaceX copies.
Continuing to target a welcome ceremony or welcome remarks in the near future at 8:35 a.m. Central Time. So a little bit more than an hour from now is Axiom Mission 4 and the International Space Station continuing to work through hatch opening procedures, but getting close, you can start to see a little bit of a window of opportunity that was just on the other side of astronaut Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers there, as they are working on IMV ducting, mixing the air of the station and Dragon, and lithium hydroxide cartridges, stowage and swapping out. So Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers are starting to clear out the hatchway, and we are going to see the first views of Axiom Mission 4. Commander Peggy Whitson, the first one across the A-Pass hatch, receiving great big hugs from Nicole Ayers and the Expedition 73 crew. Axiom Mission 4, welcome aboard the International Space Station. Pilot Shubhanshu Shukla is the next one to come across, representing ISRO. It is his first space flight for Peggy Whitson, her return to the International Space Station on her 5th flight, second as a member of Axiom Space. Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA, representing the nation of Poland. And their first visit to the International Space Station is next to cross the hatchway. And warm hugs all around. And applause breaking out here inside of Mission Control Houston and International Space Station Flight Control Room. And Tibor Kapu, the fourth and final member of Axiom Mission 4, representing Hunor and the nation of Hungary. Their first visit to the International Space Station as well. Great big hugs and handshakes across all members of Expedition 73 and Axiom Mission 4 is Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers of NASA, along with Johnny Kim, Kirill Peskov, Sergei Ryzhikov, and Alexei Zabritsky of Roscosmos, and Takuya Onishi, commander of Expedition 73 and of JAXA, with handshakes and hugs for Peggy Whitson, Shubhanshu Shukla, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu. And with their arrival to the International Space Station, that now makes 288 visitors to the orbiting laboratory. Axiom Mission 4 is now aboard the International Space Station. Commander Peggy Whitson in her return to the orbiting laboratory, her 5th flight. 3 is a member of NASA, and her 2nd as commander of Axiom and Axiom Space private astronaut mission, commander of Axiom 2 and here of Axiom 4. Regaling the crew with smiles and stories. To her left, or our left from her viewpoint, to her right, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA, Shubhanshu Shukla to her left of ISRO, and Tibor Kapu on that far right-hand side of our viewpoint. The crew is safely aboard the International Space Station. Welcome again to Axiom Mission 4. And we are continuing to target a formal welcome remark from the crew and being joined by the Expedition 73 team as well. That'll be at approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time. And from there, they will receive a safety briefing and begin their nearly approximately 2-week mission aboard the International Space Station, in which they will participate in around 60 research investigations representing 31 countries, with more than 24 of those experiments sponsored by the ISS National Lab. And there they all are, waving back at our coverage here inside of the International Space Station Flight Control Room.
Station Houston on 2. Thanks for the wave. Great to see everybody.
Houston Station, we're happy to be here. It's so great to be here finally. It was a long quarantine.
And with the crew now in the space station, we're going to wrap up our portion of the live joint coverage from Hawthorne. It's been an honor to support Axiom Mission 4 thus far, and we wish the crew a successful time on the space station. We're, of course, also looking forward to joining AX4 again when it's time to return home.
Ronnie, from launch to docking, it has been an absolute pleasure sharing this desk with you. What has been years in the making for India, Poland, and Hungary is now well underway. Axiom Space and NASA's joint coverage will continue from here through to the welcome ceremony as Peggy, Shubhanshu, Sławosz, and Tibor start their 2 weeks aboard the orbiting laboratory. Over the course of our crew's time on station, we will be producing mission updates from Axiom Space's own space station development facility in Houston, Texas. So we invite you to follow the progress of AX4 on axiomspace.com and through Axiom Space's social media channels.
So with that, on behalf of SpaceX, Axiom Space, and NASA, thank you all for tuning in to watch. While our stream on X is coming to a close, coverage of the welcome ceremony now continues on NASA Plus, axiom.space/live, and Axiom Space's social channels. With that, we'll turn it back over to you, Joseph. Have a great morning, everyone, and go AX4.
Go AX4.
We continue on with our live coverage of the arrival of Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station, the fourth private astronaut mission to arrive to the orbital outpost, and the first since January of 2024. We just saw the crew of 4, including Commander Peggy Whitson, Shubhanshu Shukla, pilot of ISRO, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu of ESA and HUNORT, respectively, crossed the hatchway and into the orbital outpost for the very first time. We're continuing to follow along as we'll wait for the formal welcoming remarks that are currently scheduled for roughly 8:35 a.m. Central Time, so a little bit more than an hour to go as the crew continues to settle in. After you heard the remarks from Peggy Whitson mentioning the long quarantine, the ride up, which took a little bit more than a day's time to do so, as the teams here in the International Space Station Flight Control Room and special guests in the viewing room at the back of your screen on hand to witness this special moment.